Every weekend, it's the Moore of Pittsburgh. Chris Moore. The Chris Moore Show. News Radio 1020, KDKA.
KDKA Radio News Time, 5:06. I'm Chris Moore. We're joined in this hour by Dr. Webster Tarpley. You can find a lot of his writings and his interviews at webstertarpley.net. Dr. Tarpley, welcome back to the program. Glad to speak to you again, sir.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
All right. Top of the news, they're talking about Egypt, more than 800 people dead. You say you come at this from a perspective or a view of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Would you explain that to our audience, please, sir?
Well, you have to go back a few years now, but in the 1960s and 1970s, probably the most effective leader of the developing countries was President Nasser of Egypt. And what he accomplished was to take back the Suez Canal from the British and the French and then use the tolls, right, the money that the ships pay to go through, to build the Aswan High Dam. And I've had the opportunity to fly from Cairo to Khartoum in Sudan, and that means you're flying up the Nile, right? You're flying south along the Nile. And you see this Aswan High Dam, and then you see the beginning of this huge lake, Lake Nasser. And what that practically has done for Egypt is what the Tennessee Valley Authority and similar things have done here in the United States. It used to be that the Nile would flood. Now the floods are under control. The water can be used for irrigation. The dam itself produces about 1/3 of the hydroelectric power, which is huge for this country of 90 million people. They can control malaria. There are all sorts of good things. And there was even a plan after that to build a second Nile going off to the west, going out through that desert, linking up some desert oases, which could have doubled the agricultural production. Because the biggest single problem in Egypt, the thing that makes them the biggest grain importer in the world, is that they can't feed themselves. And that means they're always at the mercy of somebody who grows grain, and that's often been the United States. And the U.S. has used that shamelessly to blackmail them. And I've seen it at very low level. The blackmail would kick in. So Egypt, it has to develop, and this is the main problem, right? With President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, his crew were against these development projects. They didn't want them. It's very, 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 very short-sighted. So now, what I think the hope is that with the political situation clarified in a month or two, we can get back to this idea of building these great projects. The other side of the coin, though, is this. Whenever you look at Egypt, think of the Suez Canal and remember that the British, the French, and the U.S. and the Israelis have never given up on taking that back from the Egyptians. They never gave up, and they still want it back. And that is one of the reasons why the U.S. and the British and others, the French, foment these jihadis, right? These militants, right? Mujahideen in the Sinai Peninsula. Because if you can get something going in the Sinai Peninsula, a rebellion, then you can move in. You can say, we have to protect the international waterway, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, what revolution are we fomenting as a country? What is Mr. Kerry and the Obama administration doing there in terms of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood? Because they all tell us on the mainstream media that they would not want them to take over the country because it would be Al-Qaeda and they would come in and there would be all sorts of opportunities for them to foment revolution.
Well, this is a complicated answer now. If you just bear with me. If you want to see what this process of reform, according to the State Department, leads to, you look at Libya and you see a country that is much worse off than it was under Gaddafi, much, much worse, because now you have armed militias killing people all over the country. You have incessant warfare among these militias, no central government, no economic development, no international policy of any kind. That's one model where the insurrection succeeds. The other one is Syria, where you have a government that is able to defend itself. They've been able to stop the insurrection in its tracks, and I think they're in the process of pushing it back. But there, of course, there are 100,000 people killed, more than half of them, of course, killed by the rebels, right? Not all killed by the government. So I think if you go back to the Arab Spring, this was in many ways a very cynical destabilization. It was the United States essentially saying, we're tired of dealing with even weak independent governments. We want to break up these independent governments. We want a world of micro-states and mini-states and failed states, and then we can simply pick and choose. We can decide what's important, right? In Libya, the oil is important, and there's some water resources that are important, and let the rest essentially go to hell. In Egypt, what's important? Well, the Suez Canal is important, and of course, the Nile, with all that water, right, that the Israelis want to get and other people would love to get, that's an important resource. So I think that's the first step. Now, Mubarak was a dictator, of course. On the other hand, he was a dictator that gave the U.S. a lot of trouble. And when, for example, when George Bush said to Mubarak, I want Egyptian troops to invade Afghanistan, the answer was no. And then George Bush went back and said, I want Egyptian troops to invade Iraq. And the answer was no again. And then he said, I want U.S. bases in Egypt. And Mubarak said no. So this was somebody who could say no. The U.S. calculation was if you get rid of Mubarak, you can get somebody who's going to be a complete puppet. And then we get the Muslim Brotherhood. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, you have to remember, was founded by the British. It is not really the Muslim Brotherhood. It is something that was created by the British in Egypt in the 1920s in order to fight the nationalists. And it was the nationalists in the 1920s were people saying, get the British out, we want to have an independent country. We're more than ready to govern ourselves. The Brotherhood said that's not the issue. The issue is that women need to wear the veil, or that there's too much drinking, alcohol in the streets, or other issues which kind of muddy the waters, right? It's kind of like what the Republican Party does, if you want to think about it in U.S. terms. But the Muslim Brotherhood was very much against Nasser. In the 1950s, the Muslim Brotherhood tried to stage rebellions against Nasser, and that was no coincidence because Nasser was the guy that the British, the French, all the imperialists and colonialists feared most. So they were sort of helping the imperialists from within. The head of the Muslim Brotherhood was received at the White House by President Eisenhower, and now we had representatives of the Muslim Brotherhood received in the Obama White House or in the State Department last year. I would say there's been an alliance between the Muslim Brotherhood and the CIA for many years. And
well, that sure doesn't ring true with what the mainstream media tells us all the time.
Well, their line is very, very contradictory now, because I'll just give you one example. Yesterday, among the Morsi supporters, among the people from the Muslim Brotherhood, there was arrested Zawahiri. This is the brother of the head of Al-Qaeda, right? Ayman Zawahiri is in Pakistan or Afghanistan. Nobody really knows. He's the head of Al-Qaeda, right? He's the successor to bin Laden. When bin Laden was killed, Ayman Zawahiri came in. He's an Egyptian. His brother was part of this operation protesting against the military counter-coup in Egypt. So you've got a direct alliance between Al-Qaeda terrorists and the Morsi Muslim Brotherhood. Now, this doesn't seem to be of any interest to these mainstream media that you mentioned, right? They don't seem to think that really means anything, which I find absolutely astounding. Anyway, the point is the following. Morsi became president, right? The Muslim Brotherhood was the best organized, and they took all the marbles, and they took all the marbles, and they did that really mercilessly, right? They didn't leave any space for anybody. 10% of Egypt is Coptic Christians, nothing for them. Probably 10 or 15% are urban liberals, right? People who are pro-Western and who want to have internet and internet freedom and things like this. Nothing for them. nothing much for other Islamists, right? There was the Salafist party, the Noor. They were sort of cut out.
Is that the reason so many Coptic churches were burned, and some people are supporting the military in the violent crackdown against them?
I mean, this past week we've had these 30 or 40 Coptic Christian. When they say Christian, it usually means Coptic Christians. Their churches were burned. Yeah, well, that's how the Muslim Brotherhood sees things, right? That if the army attacks the Muslim Brotherhood, somehow the Coptic Christians are responsible. It's a very strange way of thinking. But here's the problem. Morsi ran for president, and he said, I will raise the standard of living of the poorest workers and the poorest farmers, the so-called felachin. I want to help the poor people. When he got into power, he began showing that he was from the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is wealthy people. It is rich businessmen, doctors, lawyers, editors, professors, and people who want to go along with them. It is the 1% in many ways. So what did Morsi do? He made a deal with the International Monetary Fund, and this is always the kiss of death. And he was warned, and he should have known. Every place in the world that you bring the International Monetary Fund in, you impose austerity, and then there's tremendous social upheaval. Here's what the IMF did in Egypt. They said, we want the sales tax to be raised. Morsi did it. That means you're taxing precisely the poorest people with a regressive tax that the rich guy won't even notice, but for the poor guy, it's going to add something, very, very serious to his bill.
That's a reversal of his campaign promises.
Reversal. In other words, he betrayed his promises in the campaign.
All right. I need to take this break. Okay. Let me get this break in, and we'll pick that thought up in just a second. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest. We're talking about what's going on in Egypt, other subjects to cover, too. Stay with us.
Got issues? Talk to Chris. The Chris Moore Show. Chris Moore, News Radio 1020, KDKA.
KDK Radio News Time 520. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest. Our number is 1-866-391-1020. Dollar Bank Instant Access messages can be written to us at our website, kdka.com. Dr. Tarpley, tell me a little bit about General Sisi. Is he in the mold of defying, as Nasser did, the U.S. government in the guise of Mr. Obama and Mr. Kerry? And what about all these other projects that you mentioned, the Second Nile and others that you haven't mentioned, at Cairo to Cape, Fast Rail, right. These other development projects that would take place under those kinds of leaders versus the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, the Muslim Brotherhood was hostile to those projects. That's the most important thing. Since the beginning, since the Arab Spring, I have been hoping and watching to see Nasserists come forward, people in the mold of President Nasser, who was a general. He was a colonel. He was a colonel and a military man. So this time we have General Sisi, and I think these are some of the best cultural impulses. In other words, national independence, dignity, economic development. That, I think, is Sisi. He has emerged in this process, and if you go to Cairo, you're going to see these posters all over the place of Nasser and Sisi. You can get tie tacks, you can get buttons to wear, you can get lapel pins, you can get flags, banners, posters, Nasser and Sisi. So he has touched the chord. Before we get to the development projects, though, let me go back to why Morsi had to go, because this is a serious problem, right? You don't want to have a coup d'etat for no reason, right? You don't want to do that without really compelling cause. So, again, Morsi came in, Muslim Brotherhood. They are the rich people. They do social work, right? But they are the rich people. He comes in. He says, I'm going to help the standard of living of poor people. Then he makes a deal with the International Monetary Fund to increase the sales tax, to go to a value-added tax, which would have been even bigger. They never quite got to it, but that would have been even worse. And then there are these subsidies, right? One of the things left over from Nasser is they put a floor under the poorest people by having bread, cooking oil, household fuel for heating and cooking, and indeed gasoline. They put a floor under that so that the price is subsidized. In other words, the price is kept down so that the standard of living doesn't sink below a certain level. And this is most appreciated by people who are poor, right? By people who need to buy a loaf of bread at a subsidized price. The thing that Morsi did, I think the beginning of the end for Morsi was that he accepted the demand of the IMF to double the price of gasoline. Now you imagine, here in the United States, right, we're not as poor as Egypt, but you double the price of gasoline, there's going to be a tremendous uproar as a result of that. That is what Morsi did. So he essentially promised also that he was going to remove the bread subsidy. Now, the last time anybody tried to remove the bread subsidy was in 1977 under Sadat, and the masses came out into the street. They scared the daylights out of Sadat, and he said, "I'm sorry. I'm not going to touch the bread subsidy." The IMF has always been hammering away at that bread subsidy. They just don't give up, and you need it. I'm absolutely convinced it's economically a good thing. Now, the other thing with Morsi is he claims to be legitimate, okay? He says, I'm the legitimate government. But what he then did, after selling out to the IMF, he did his own constitutional amendment. He said, I'm the president. I'm declaring a constitutional amendment that I'm above the law, that I can't be reviewed by the courts, and that I have, sweeping executive powers. So he was going along like this, right? And his unpopularity was growing. The Muslim Brotherhood was excluding everybody. They were grabbing for every scrap of power. They wanted to monopolize it, right? So they got a lot of people really antagonized. And then we come to the big crisis of the middle of June, which is when this current business began. They had a meeting in the middle of June in Cairo, and it was attended by some of the most incendiary preachers in the Muslim Brotherhood world, in particular a guy called Qaradawi. And Qaradawi, he broadcasts on Al Jazeera Arabic. You don't see him here, but he has a very big audience. They don't put him on the English language because he'd really shock people. But on the Arabic, Al Jazeera, coming from Doha, he's on there. So he declared jihad against Syria, the idea being that Egypt should go to war with Syria. This is a shocking thing. Egypt against Syria in a war. Now, they used to be the same country. There was a time in the 50s and 60s when Egypt and Syria were, at least on paper, one country. It was called the United Arab Republic. It was under the influence of Nasser. But now they said, not only are we not the same country, we want to go and kill our brothers in Syria. And the people around Morsi began saying, we can send volunteers, we can send Egyptian fanatics to go fight in Syria and kill people, and then they can come back and they can, bring the results of their work. So this was very, very scary. In the middle of this rally, Morsi broke diplomatic relations with Syria. He said, I'm kicking out the Syrian ambassador. The very next day, the army put out a statement saying, we will not be going into Syria. Our job is to defend our own country, not to engage in aggression against Syria. And as if this weren't enough, a second war was on the agenda. And this one was Ethiopia, which is a Christian country, right? It's not in the Islamic world. There was a meeting of Morsi's supporters in the beginning of June where they thought the television microphones were turned off, and instead they were on. And they began saying, the Ethiopians want to build a dam on the Blue Nile. They're going to try to take some water. Well, we get all the water, right? But it's not true. There's a sharing agreement. The Ethiopians are well within their rights. But they said, these supporters of Morsi started to say, well, what should we do? Maybe we should bomb whatever they build. We should send our Air Force and bomb it. And then the guy said, no, that's too crude. We'll just foment a rebellion of separatists and terrorists in the zone where the dam is going to be built, and we can fight them that way. So not one, but two wars. And then beyond that, it's now becoming, I think, fairly obvious that the Muslim Brotherhood was attempting a coup from inside the government. In other words, something that would have involved a dictatorship, and it would have been aimed at the army.
All right, let me interrupt you and ask you to pick up that thought when we complete this next break. Stay with us. KDK Radio News Time, 5:30. We have to step aside for a news update from CBS in New York. We'll continue with Dr. Webster Tarpley as we talk about history and tie in American history and the Russian fleet arriving here in 1863, how that helped Lincoln in their own Civil War. Stay with us for more on KDKA.
The Chris Moore Show. News Radio 1020. KDKA.
KDK Radio News Time, 5:32. Dr. Webster Tarpley is our guest. Dr. Tarpley, I wanted to allow you to finish your point that you were making. We'll take some phone calls at 1-866-391-1020. Well, go ahead, finish your point.
The point that the Egyptian crisis was brought to a head by events in Syria. In the first week of June, the main fortress of the Syrian rebels in a city called Qusair near the Lebanon border was liberated by the Syrian army and by Hezbollah coming out of Lebanon. And at that point, everybody in London and Paris especially began to get very worried that this army of terrorists that has been assembled in Syria to overthrow the Assad government was in danger of being wiped out, and they tried to find ways to save them. And one of the things that happened involved the United States. There was a meeting of the National Security Council on June 12th where Secretary of State Kerry, I suppose true to his skull and bones tradition, right, which is a very bad one in American history, he said, we've got to begin bombing Syria right now, today. And you get the idea from the way he said it that he was talking about doing it without saying anything to President Obama. Just go ahead and start the bombing. And we have had such things happen. We had Al Gore bombing Yugoslavia in 1999 without telling Clinton. We had Kissinger going to full nuclear alert in 1973 without telling Nixon. So there is precedent for something like this. Fortunately, General Dempsey, who seems to be loyal maybe to Obama, maybe to the Constitution, said no to Kerry and this crazy proposal to start bombing Syria. So they couldn't do it that way. That was the 12th. 3 days later, at this rally in Cairo, they get Morsi to cavort with these jihadis, takfiris, they call them in the Middle East, right? Extremists. And they're all talking jihad against Syria, send volunteers, send the army. This scared the daylights out of the Egyptian army because they don't want to be sent to a war in Syria. Nothing could be more insane from their point of view. They don't want to be drawn into this huge confessional sectarian conflict. So I think at that point the army began thinking about their own future. And the problem, the fear that they also had was that if Morsi were able to consolidate a dictatorship, a lot of these top generals would have been assassinated. That would have been the model for the Muslim Brotherhood. In other words, if you can keep the lid on the army and prevent them from acting, you can simply eliminate them one by one. And I think that's happened in other countries.
Well, look, I've interviewed a number of people about this, and they say there's really no good position that the American government can take. If they end up supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, they put the Islamists in charge who hate us. If they arm the revolutions both in Syria and in Egypt, that only supports the would-be terrorists who would want to hurt us. If we protect the governments, that is protecting someone who is putting their own people down. What do you say to that kind of rhetoric I see floating around?
Let's look at what actually happens, because what's happening in Egypt is sort of what happened in Syria at the beginning, and it's sort of what happened in Libya. What you had was the army saying Morsi is out. I would call that a counter coup, because I see the Muslim Brotherhood in a slow-motion coup, a cold coup involving these foreign wars and involving a crackdown against the officer corps, right, getting rid of a lot of them. So I think it was a counter coup in self-defense by General Sisi and the others. Now, then the Muslim Brotherhood calls in their supporters, right? They can get millions of people into the streets. But at that point, you can see this on various television channels if you look carefully. There's plenty of film showing civilian gunmen of the Muslim Brotherhood shooting at the soldiers. So it's easy, right? Once you get the army in the streets, or the police in this case, and you get a large demonstration, you send in provocateurs. You send in people with guns who plant themselves in the peaceful crowd, if that's what it is. They start shooting at the police and the soldiers, and then they shoot back, and from there you can simply make it escalate. You could see yesterday there was a Muslim Brotherhood sniper in the minaret of a mosque shooting at the troops. About 100 cops have been killed in the last couple of days, and those cops were not killed by the army. They were killed by the Muslim Brotherhood and their supporters. So there's a tremendous hypocrisy. And if you look, the Muslim Brotherhood, if they don't get what they want, they go and burn 30 to 40 churches, and they go and attack police stations and kill cops. And this emirate, right? There's this terrorist emirate of the northern Sinai, which Morsi refused to do anything about. Right?
So what should the United States government's role in this be, if anything?
Well, first of all, stop meddling in the internal affairs of other countries, right? We have Samantha Power at the United Nations who thinks it's up to her to try to, dictate the terms of democracy to Egypt. Those days are gone. Rather, you got to look at the logic of the established government, which right now is the army, and it is General Sisi, who it seems to me he has the popular mandate. In other words, at least at the moment, he's got public opinion behind him. It is not realistic to think that you can bribe or punish Egypt with $1.5 billion of military aid. Sisi just got $12 billion from the Saudis, who are so afraid of what might happen in Egypt that they're willing to pay protection money, and other Gulf states are also happy to pay that protection money. I think the one thing to do would be to provide some assistance in these economic development plans. You got to remember, the presence of the United States in Egypt in the first place went back to Eisenhower in 1956, saying that the British, the French, and the Israelis should stop invading Egypt, which is what they were doing, right? Right before the U.S. election, 1956, the British, the French, and the Israelis attacked Egypt to get the Suez Canal back. And Eisenhower said, no, back down, back off. And that's the only way the U.S. got a foothold in Egypt. So
we haven't done anything that sensible since that time. I mean, look at what we did in Libya. Look at the projects that they had in terms of developing that tunnel and bringing water to the desert.
This is similar. The Great Man-Made River was started by Gaddafi in the late 90s, right? And this is why you can still get a drink of water in Tripoli or Benghazi today. What Mubarak did was this second Nile. It's called Tushka, the New Valley Project, right? Where you take some of the water from Lake Nasser and you send it off to the west and across the desert, because it's trackless, right? Everybody in Egypt lives in this extremely narrow corridor along the Nile. Well, if that's the case, then get a second Nile, and at least that will give you double the agricultural production that you had to begin with.
But why does the 1%? Well, silly question, why does the 1% in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood not want that? That would help their country prosper.
Well, they say that big projects of economic development have Nasser and Mubarak written on them, and that's just crazy.
It is crazy. All right, let me squeeze a phone call in here. Al in Bethel Park, you're on KDK with Dr. Webster Tarpley.
Hey, Chris, this is Al. I'm calling back, taking my call with you. So we're not going to mention that S word that you can't spell. Your guest is so intelligent that I've enjoyed this conversation thoroughly. And at a couple points, I want to thank you guys for a great, education here. I'm a big history guy, and I appreciate your conversation. But I do have a couple points that I did want to bring up.
Okay, get to them quickly if you can, please.
I'm going to try my best. Here's what it is. Tribal societies, that's what has not changed in over 2,000 years, as your esteemed doctor has told you, in a sense, and follow the money. Now, the money changes how the tribes think, because when we like somebody, we meddle into politics, we get a strong man. Then he does the dirty work, we ignore a lot of it, and people get upset about it over a generation. Then look what happens. Alexander the Great couldn't conquer all the tribes. What he did is assimilated some of their customs and everything. That's how he conquered the world then. What we should do is stay out of it, take the money. What's 1.5 billion, like your guest said? That's nothing. And how do you stop them from fighting among themselves? That's a tribal battle. There's history there. We're not going to change it. None of us three will change that history. Their families, their friends, their villages. And you know that, Doctor. You've been there, I assume.
Dr. Tarpley?
Well, the one thing, what I try to do is to propose economic development programs, right? And the two things they would have to do. The first thing is to seize control of the Egyptian central bank, turn it into a national bank on the Alexander Hamilton model, and start putting out the equivalent of $1 trillion or $2 US to build things that you can build with in-country resources. You have labor, you have some steel, you have cement. You could start building a roadway system, right?
Doctor,
and housing. You could build several million.
I want to interrupt you
housing
one
units.
second here. If you had education, if you built schools that changed their thought process to educate them on how to get out of this situation and tie it in with what you're talking about, the infrastructure, correct?
Yeah, but look, I think you're selling the Egyptians short. This is a very sophisticated population in many ways. In other words, there is a middle class. They are very well educated. You have to remember, the awakening of Egypt started more than 200 years ago. It's the first Arab country to be wrenched into the modern world when Napoleon invaded, right? Napoleon and the Battle of the Pyramid.
Right.
The French in Egypt started them into modernization. After that, they had a guy called Muhammad Ali. Now, you think the Muhammad Ali maybe is the boxer, but Muhammad Ali was the Khedive. He was the ruler of Egypt in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and he had a lot of modernizing reforms going on. In other words, he's kind of the model for people like Ataturk later on, or Nasser later on, or other people. So I think what the U.S. has done would be, first of all, stop supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. Stop supporting Al-Qaeda, right? This is one of the things that's going on is you go to Cairo, you see the pictures, right? I haven't been there lately, but you can see the pictures on the internet. The posters say Obama and Ann Patterson support terrorism. Ann Patterson was the U.S. ambassador until now.
Yes.
And what they mean by that is those are liberals. In other words, those are pro-Western people saying, you, United States, you were supporting the Muslim Brotherhood. You didn't do anything to rein in Morsi and his crazy excesses. And now you're telling us that we can't crack down. And by the way, let me mention, there is a proposal to bring Robert Ford in as the next U.S. ambassador. This is an absolute disaster. This is coming from Kerry. It's not coming from Obama. Obama needs to be warned not to do this. This Robert Ford is the death squad expert. In other words, he is associated with John Negroponte. Negroponte started with the death squads in Central America. He then brought them to Iraq when he was the U.S. ambassador. Ford studied with him. Ford was then the U.S. ambassador in Syria when the death squads got going there. Right. Nobody wants him. I can't imagine that Egypt would allow Ford in, but I think it would be good for the United States not to insult them again by proposing him. He should. I agree.
Let me interrupt. Al, I'm late for a break. A quick final comment from you.
Well, I agree with that in general, and I know that people are much more educated than you say. But I think if you put more schools and base it on education to help more of the people to increase that middle class, just like we were.
All right. Thank you, Al. I have to take this break. We'll be right back with Dr. Webster Tarpley.
Pittsburgh's Weekend Talker, Chris Moore. News Radio 1020 KDKA.
Back to the phones we go with Dr. Webster Tarpley. Well, before we go to the phones, let's get him to give us a little history, a lesson about our own Civil War and what happened with the arrival of the Soviet fleet back here in 1863. There's going to be a big thing in Washington, D.C. also on September 24th about this anniversary, isn't there?
Well, I hope so. We're certainly going to have a commemoration. We have a debt of honor to pay here. In the U.S. Civil War, there were three turning points in 1863, 150 years ago right now. And, of course, the most famous is the Battle of Gettysburg in your state, right? The 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of July that ended Lee's invasion of the North. However, you have to remember what Lee was looking for was intervention by Britain and France. You had Lord John Russell and Lord Palmerston in London and Napoleon III in Paris, who were very interested in coming into the Civil War on the side of the Confederacy and destroying the Union and defeating Lincoln. And that was their project. And they were prevented. I just mentioned the Vicksburg, of course, the 4th of July was the fall of Vicksburg to Grant. That's the second turning point. But the third turning point is the arrival of the Russian fleets in New York on September 24th, 1863, and in San Francisco on October 12th, 1863. They later on went to visit Boston and, indeed, Washington, D.C.
And that's in a signal to both the French and the British that they should be hands off?
That's right. And it was sent by the fleets. The fleets were to back up a message that they had already gotten from Tsar Alexander II. Now, here's the parallelism. Tsar Alexander II is the Russian ruler who did the most to free the serfs slightly before the American Civil War, right? 23 million people were not exactly slaves, but they were almost slaves. And, of course, Lincoln, with the Emancipation Proclamation as a war measure, that was the first giant step towards getting rid of slavery here in the United States. So in many ways, these are the two most progressive people that you're going to find in the world at that time, Lincoln and Alexander II, whereas the British and Napoleon III, no, they're not. They're involved in things like the Opium Wars, right? Forcing China to buy opium from India so that they would destroy, many generations of people. Anyway, the British and the French were eager to attack from 1861 to 1862 to 1863, and there are at least three moments when the British and the French are close to attacking. The most severe is 1862 to 1863. But they get a message. They send to the Tsar in St. Petersburg, and they say, look, we want to attack Lincoln. Won't you come and join us? And the Tsar answers them. This is in late 1862. He says, not only will I not join you, but if you do this, I will wage war against you. And in order to prove to you that this is serious, I'm going to send my fleets to New York and San Francisco. And this is what he did. The Russian squadron arriving in New York right after those awful draft riots, right, that had taken place in July. This was a tremendous boost to the morale of the North. It's the only important help that Lincoln got from anybody in the world, right? You have to remember, when the United States had no friends and needed friends, there was one friend, and it was a big friend. It was Russia. And in the case of San Francisco, it's really dramatic because the United States at that time had a one-ocean navy. We couldn't afford enough warships to patrol the Pacific coast. So the Russian squadron is sitting in San Francisco. The report comes in that a Confederate raider, the Alabama or the Sumter or the Shenandoah, is approaching and wants to come in and attack and burn San Francisco. So the Russian admiral gets ready for action. He mobilizes his fleet. The Russian admiral is going to defend San Francisco from the Confederates if need be. Now, they never arrived, but he was ready to do this. And the word is, from all the reliable sources, the Russian admiral had sealed orders that said, if Britain and France attack the United States, you, Russian admiral, will put yourself under the command of Lincoln, and you will cooperate with the United States Navy, and you will act as commerce raiders or other projects, but you will track down British merchant ships and French merchant ships on the high seas and destroy them and do tremendous damage to the British. Because otherwise the British could have bottled them up, right? Bottled them up in the Baltic or bottled them up in various places in the Far East. So This was the turning point. This is absolutely critical.
Wow, that's amazing. All right, let me get one call in quickly. Adam in the South Hills, quickly, please go.
Hey, Mr. Chris. Doctor, the thing that's confusing me the most for all this is now I've got McCain running around the country saying that we're all a bunch of idiots for, not back in the military now, when it sounds like the Muslim Brotherhood wasn't going to be a good deal for anybody.
All right, I ask you to respond to that.
I mean, McCain changes every day, right? But McCain this morning on the talk shows is saying you got to cut off all aid to Egypt and protect the Muslim Brotherhood from the army. So he's backing the Muslim Brotherhood now. It's amazing, right? He was so worried about terrorism. Well, the Muslim Brotherhood is, you've got the top Al Qaeda guy's brother is part of this operation to reimpose Morsi. What more do you need?
All right, Dr. Tarpley, we're out of time, but where can people read more of your writing, sir?
Oh, well, please take a look at tarpley.net, and Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed, especially with this fast-moving stuff in Egypt. Twitter is a good way to keep up with it.
I appreciate you coming on the program.
Thank you.
Quickly, where are we with the school legislation for loans?
Well, what has happened is there is a proposal which has passed one house of the Congress, which is to have the interest rate depend on the 10-year bond from the Treasury, right? But the Treasury 10-year bond has gone up by almost a full percentage point.
All right.
You see how dangerous that is.
We'll have to have you on again.
In a couple of weeks.
We'll have you on again to talk about that. Okay.
Great.
Thank
Sure.
you.
Look forward to it. Thank you. Countries. Was President Nasser of Egypt. And what he accomplished was to take back the Suez Canal from the British and the French and then use the tolls, right, the money that the ships pay to go through, to build the Aswan High Dam. And I've had the opportunity to fly from Cairo to Khartoum in Sudan, and that means you're flying up the Nile, right? You're flying south along the Nile. And you see this Aswan High Dam, and then you see the beginning of this huge lake, Lake Nasser. And what that practically has done for Egypt is what the Tennessee Valley Authority and similar things have done here in the United States. It used to be that the Nile would flood. Now the floods are under control. The water can be used for irrigation. The dam itself produces about 1/3 of the hydroelectric power, which is huge for this country of 90 million people. They can control malaria. There are all sorts of good things, and there was even a plan.
The mainstream media that they would not want them to take over the country because it would be Al Qaeda, and they would come in, and there would be all sorts of opportunities for them to foment revolution.
Well, this is a complicated answer. Now, if you just bear with me, if you want to see what this process of reform, according to the State Department, leads to, you look at Libya, and you see a country that is much worse off than it was under Gaddafi, much, much worse, because now you have armed militias killing people all over the country. You have incessant warfare among these militias, no central government, no economic development, no international policy of any kind. That's one model where the insurrection succeeds. The other one is Syria, where you have a government that is able to defend itself. They've been able to stop the insurrection in its tracks, and I think they're in the process of.
Every weekend, it's the Moore of Pittsburgh. Chris Moore. The Chris Moore Show. News Radio 1020, KDKA.
KDKA Radio News Time, 5:06. I'm Chris Moore. We're joined in this hour by Dr. Webster Tarpley. You can find a lot of his writings and his interviews at webstertarpley.net. Dr. Tarpley, welcome back to the program. Glad to speak to you again, sir.
Thank you very much. Glad to be with you.
All right. Top of the news, they're talking about Egypt, more than 800 people dead. You say you come at this from a perspective or a view of Gamal Abdel Nasser. Would you explain that to our audience, please, sir?
Well, you have to go back a few years now, but in the 1960s and 1970s, probably the most effective leader of the developing building these great projects. The other side of the coin, though, is this. Whenever you look at Egypt, think of the Suez Canal and remember that the British, the French, and the U.S. and the Israelis have never given up on taking that back from the Egyptians. They never gave up, and they still want it back. And that is one of the reasons why the U.S. and the British and others, the French, foment these jihadis, right? These militants, right? Mujahideen in the Sinai Peninsula, because if you can get something going in the Sinai Peninsula, a rebellion, then you can move in. You can say, we have to protect the international waterway, and that's what we're going to do.
Well, what revolution are we fomenting as a country? What is Mr. Kerry and the Obama administration doing there in terms of supporting the Muslim Brotherhood? Because they all tell us on...
And after that, to build a second Nile going off to the west, going out through that desert, linking up some desert oases, which could have doubled the agricultural production. Because the biggest single problem in Egypt, the thing that makes them the biggest grain importer in the world, is that they can't feed themselves. And that means they're always at the mercy of somebody who grows grain, and that's often been the United States. And the U.S. has used that shamelessly to blackmail them. And I've seen it at very low level. The blackmail would kick in. So Egypt, it has to develop, and this is the main problem, right? With President Morsi of the Muslim Brotherhood, his crew were against these development projects. They didn't want them. It's very, 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 very short-sighted. So now, what I think the hope is that with the political situation clarified in a month or two, we can get back to this idea of